It's News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome to the Marc Kapetan Show. This is attorney Marc Kapetan, your host. Today's show is brought to you by the Kapetan Brothers Law Firms, serving the Central Valley since 1995. If you or anybody you know has been injured in an auto accident, a truck accident, or a motorcycle accident, give us a call at 559-498-8000. Or if you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, call us 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, we are the Valley's law firm. Well, folks, I'm very excited about today's guest because when you're talking about 7 degrees of separation from famous people, this guy had a 1 degree separation from probably one of my heroes in the political world. Soon after graduating from law school, our next guest wrote a letter. Get this, he wrote a letter effectively to the then President of the United States, Richard Milhous Nixon, or at least his administration, in response to the administration seeking a team of people to be on a newly formed speechwriting staff. Well, the administration, Nixon, answered, and for the next 20 or so years, my next guest served as a speechwriter to 2 presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and 1 vice president, Dan Quayle. Not bad for an Armenian kid from Southern California, right? So it is an honor for me to welcome to the show Ken Khachigian. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Hey, listen, it's exciting. I don't think you know, but to us kids from the 1980s who were becoming adults in the 1980s, to have someone closely related to a guy like President Reagan is it's thrilling for me because of the impact that he had on the young people of the 1980s. I mean, do you realize the significance to a young kid like me of Reagan and his impact on changing the face of the pride of America back in those early times?
Well, that was the intent of the speeches that he delivered, and that was his intent of changing the mood of America. And all the speeches he delivered, beginning back when he worked for General Electric and traveled all across the country on behalf of General Electric as a spokesperson. And then you don't remember this, but he hosted General Electric Theater, which was one of the most popular shows on television for years.
I've seen the rerun. I've seen the reruns. I didn't know that he did that as basically a national promotional. So he was basically a pitchman from very, very early on.
Yes. Yeah. He traveled the country for General Electric as a national spokesperson and traveled all over the country and gave speeches as a promotional person for General Electric. And in fact, the house he lived in Pacific Palisades was a promotion. He lived in an all-electric home, which was fairly unusual in those days because they were also promoting gas appliances in those days. But he lived in an all-electric home in Pacific Palisades.
Yeah, that was a big deal. I remember seeing some of the old ads where they would say, hey, this 100% electric, no gas. And
exactly, yeah.
So he was sort of into basically promoting not only America and his American ideals with when he was in the union, the Actors Guild, but also just basically the greatness of American ingenuity through something like GE, right?
Right. And the free enterprise system and very early on, he was preaching lower taxes. And back in the days as an actor, some of those actors were making pretty good bucks. An actor at their heyday might be making a couple $100,000 a year, which in the 40s and 50s was a lot of money. But the high tax rate in those days was 90%. The maximum tax rate. And so he had personal interest. There was such a horrible high tax rate that it was almost, virtually confiscatory. So he had a personal interest in that. Plus, he also he used to say to me personally that he had a retirement fund that he had while he was an actor, and then if he had to rely on that, by the time he reached retirement age, inflation would have eaten it all up and it would have been worthless.
So his whole, I mean, we're going to get to Reagan a lot more later on,
Sure.
But his whole philosophy and his whole mindset was basically to free the individual, to free them of the burdens of government regulation and government taxes, and allow them to flourish like maybe many of the people getting out of the Depression were able to do.
Exactly. And of course, he was a child of the Depression.
Right.
And he got an opportunity out of college to, as one of his first jobs was as a radio announcer at WHO in Des Moines, Iowa, where he would broadcast there the games of the St. Louis Cardinals. And so he had back then, of course, throughout his career, he had that wonderful voice.
Right. And
he managed to get an audition out in when they were doing a game during spring training out in Los Angeles. And Jack Warner saw him in the audition, and that's when he got his first shot at Hollywood. So, but he believed in that whole free enterprise system, where when you got your shot at an opportunity, and a kid out of the Depression like he was, he was a Democrat well into the 50s.
Yeah,
and and then he was a union. He used to brag about being a union member, head of the Screen Actors Guild, representing his union on behalf of his fellow actors and actresses.
And he eventually saw the light, as us Republicans like to say. But no, it made him a very balanced guy. I mean, I'll talk a little bit later about some of the misperceptions that people had about him, but it made him a balanced guy to where people may not have thought he was empathetic to liberal causes or the plight of the workers, but he was one of those for a majority of his life until, like you said, in the 50s when he changed to become a Republican. Right?
Exactly. No. He saw firsthand the effects of the Depression and felt it himself growing up. And he lived in poverty in his early years, and he knew what it was like. And he was lucky to get a college degree and worked hard. And in the summers he was a lifeguard, and so he didn't live a life of privilege like a lot of the kids do these days. And so he saw what the value was of earning your way through life and being a success. And so that's what guided him in terms of his philosophy, his political philosophy, and his culture.
Yeah, and it wasn't, a lot of people see him as just the actor or a person who was playing the part, but basically these were deeply held values that he had, all the way from being the poor kid in Dixon, Illinois, and his having this poor mother who was struggling. He was basically the everyman as far as that was concerned for people, and a lot of people just didn't see that.
Exactly that, and of course, he had an alcoholic father as well. So he had a tough upbringing, and so all of that was ingrained into his life, and he saw both sides of the world. So everybody thought he was just sort of the product of Beverly Hills when he was president. But in meetings I had with him, he constantly talked about how the sympathy he had for folks who had to live hand to mouth, and he felt that the tax system was a burden, not less on the wealthy than it was on the middle class.
Right. Well, listen, you knew him better than most people will ever hope to. So we're going to get back to Ken Khachigian, speechwriter for President Nixon and President Reagan, and we're going to start off with a little bit of your start of your career and how you flourished and became successful. We'll be right back with Ken Khachigian after this. This is the Marc Kapetan Show on KMJ. It's News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. This is attorney Marc Kapetan, your host. Hey, folks, listen, I'm going to pop this music down like I like to do. And I just want to let you know, I want to talk to you personally here, folks. Listen, if you or anybody you know has been injured in an accident, I know it's a very trying, very difficult time. It is a very scary time. You're probably hurting in bed, or you have friends who are reaching out to you needing help because they've been in an accident. If you've been in an accident, or you know somebody who's been in an accident, do them a favor, do yourself a favor, call your local attorney. Don't call these LA guys. Sorry, Ken, I know you're down there in San Clemente area, but call your local attorney who knows best the local system. Call the Kapetan brothers if you would like, 498-8000, 559-498-8000. If you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, call us, Kapetan brothers, 498-8000, Kapetan brothers. We are the Valley's law firm. Okay, we are back on with Ken Khachigian. He was a speechwriter for President Nixon and Ronald Reagan, and also Vice President Quayle. We were talking about Reagan, and I do want to get back to him, but let's start again with you, Ken. You were just out of law school, and you had this confidence to write a letter to offer your services to write presidential speeches, which to me is an amazing sense of moxie, an amazing sense of confidence that a young kid would have. How did that come about that you just wrote a letter to a presidential administration saying, hey, I think I could write great speeches for you?
Let me correct the record just a little bit and tell you how this all came about. Yeah. I was actually a second-year law student at Columbia in New York, and I saw an article in the New York Times that Richard Nixon was going to run for re-election, and noticed the folks around him, the young staff he had gathered, and so I was really interested in politics and had followed him when I was at UCSB. I met him, ran into him when he was running for governor. Anyway, I was very interested in it. So I wrote a letter to him at his law office in New York City. He was on 20 Broad Street there at the time. And I wrote a letter to his law office and said, Mr. Nixon, I'd like to see if I could volunteer for your presidential campaign that's coming up. And I was 23 years old, and I didn't hear a reply, and so, which troubled me. So I called his office and I said, I wrote a letter to Mr. Nixon and I didn't hear back. And they said, maybe it got lost in the mail.
Yeah, right.
So they said, send it again. So I sent it. This time, my wife worked on 30 Wall Street. She was, while I was going through law school, she was an assistant at an investment management firm. 30 Wall. So she walked it over to 20 Broad and handed it to somebody. And a couple of weeks later, I get a letter back from a fellow named, you might recognize the name, Pat Buchanan.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He wrote me a note and said, hey, why don't you come on in for an interview? So Pat interviewed me, and of course, he teases me. I think, I don't know if I had a little scraggly beard at the time or not, but he teases me that because I was at Columbia Law School, he thought I might be a Rockefeller spy. Anyway, they brought me on, and basically I just to do correspondence and answer letters, and I after answering letters for a couple of weeks, I said, look, I can do better than this. And, I'd leave classes right after class at Columbia. I'd zip up to Fifth Avenue and every chance I got, I'd offer some research services or whatever I could do. And right up until the end of school in the end of May. And Marty Anderson, who was out of Hoover, was a policy guy. And I would bug him every chance I got. And finally he said, we could use your help. And that's when the campaign was getting really ramped up. Right. And they hired me for the campaign in the summer. So between my second and third year of law school is when I actually worked in the presidential campaign as a young assistant. And But then I had to go back to law school. But my boss in the campaign was actually Alan Greenspan.
Oh wow! Who became head of Wall Street basically?
He was head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and then he headed the Federal Reserve Board.
So let me ask you, Nixon. He was a legislator from what state originally? Do you remember?
President Nixon.
Yeah, President Nixon.
Well, he was from California. He was from the 12th congressional district down in Whittier.
That's right, because of the San Clemente connection. Yeah, I keep on thinking
he was a U.S. senator from California.
Okay, that's what it was. So, I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I'm thinking
vice president. Yeah.
I kept on thinking Michigan and Ford, so that's what threw me off, basically. So, did you know him from? You said you were volunteering and stuff. Were you helping out? And did you know him from California, or you just started?
No, I was just a twerp. I never even got to meet him until in the White House. I was hardly ever got to see him. I'd be in big meetings where I got to sit in the background, and then finally got one time opportunity to go in the Oval Office and have a picture taken with him. But back in the Nixon White House, I was a young staff aide, and I didn't really get to know him till after he resigned, and I came out to San Clemente to help him work on his memoirs.
Right.
And for 4 years then, here in San Clemente, I became intimately connected with him.
And I understand that. Let me ask you, though, quickly, though, so he wasn't on your radar until he was running for president. When you had that first meeting with him, although it may have been brief and you didn't have a lot of meetings and contact like you did with President Reagan, what was your first impression of Nixon? Was he a personable guy? I mean, he always had this sort of off-putting... well, let's put it this way. He wasn't loved by the media, and I don't know if that got down to a personal level where he wasn't a personable guy, but he was just a good leader as far as that's concerned.
Well, the first meeting I had, like I told you, was at UCSB when I was a freshman, and my roommate and I, who was also from Visalia, we were on the debate team, and we went to see him at a rally he did in Santa Barbara running for governor. And when he left the rally, we cornered him and said, "Hey, Mr. Nixon, we're on the debate team at UCSB, and what advice do you have?" And he chatted with us for 2 or 3 minutes, and he was very comfortable talking to us and gave us advice on how to debate and be conversationalists, and so he was very comfortable in conversation with us. And
right.
So, some people found him off-putting, but he was very good at small talk and interchanging with people, and so I think people have a different view of him than he really was. I think, but there was a tough side to him, which I'm glad that he was when he was dealing with the Soviet Union
and China, et cetera. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I understand, though, that, and talking about the personal side, is he almost changed the face of speech writing and the speech and the fact of forming a speech writing team, because he wanted a team of speech writers when before there may have been just 1 or 2 speech writers for a president, and he wanted people with different styles. He appreciated hearing from a bunch of different styles.
Right. So on the Nixon speech writing staff, you had the conservative, you had Pat Buchanan, and then you had
Ray Price, right?
Ray Price, who was sort of a moderate and who actually worked at the old New York Herald Tribune and wrote the endorsement for Lyndon Johnson for president back in 1964. And then you had Bill Staffire, who later was a New York Times columnist, and Bill was sort of a moderate conservative. So you had a balance, and then you had several junior speechwriters, which had a mixture of us, but the junior speechwriters didn't get to write big speeches. And Nixon wrote most of all his, what he did And then on the really, really big speeches, he had mostly help from Ray Price. And then depending upon the event, if it was going to be to a conservative audience, political speech, he'd have Buchanan, or it was an economic speech. Bill Sapphire was specialized in economic speeches.
Right.
And so everybody had a little different specialty.
So he really played to the base as far as I was concerned.
Exactly.
Yeah. We're going to be right back with Ken Khachigian, a very, very interesting conversation we're having regarding Nixon and Reagan and his life as a speechwriter for 2 presidents and 1 vice president. We'll be back with Ken Khachigian on the Marc Kapetan Show right after this. This is KMJ. It's News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. Folks, you know the drill. If you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, call the Kapetan brothers at 559-498-8000. Or if you've been injured in an auto accident, a truck accident, or a motorcycle accident, who do we call, Marcella? She says the Kapetan Brothers Law Firm. There we go. Thank you, Marcella, my producer. Yes, call the Kapetan Brothers at 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, 559-498-8000. We are the Valley's Law Firm. Hey, Marcella, I understand that your brother's name is?
Jose Solorio.
Jose Solorio. Ken, you know Jose Solorio. He was a California representative?
I think it was an assemblyman, yeah.
Assemblyman, yeah. So, yeah, I understand you knew him pretty well and that he's a pretty good guy, even though he's a Democrat, that he's a pretty good guy.
For a Democrat, he's a good guy.
No, that's what you said. Yeah, it's just small. It's such a small world that there's all these connections. Okay, listen. We were talking with Ken Khachigian, folks. He is a speechwriter for President Nixon and for President Reagan, and also eventually for Dan Quayle, the vice president under Bush. Under Bush 1, actually, yeah. So let me ask you this. You say that a guy like Nixon wanted... I understand he wrote most of his speech and that he would love just getting little nuggets or quips or even sometimes jokes from you guys.
He did, and he also had, presidents often reach out to professional joke writers as well.
Oh, really? Who was his guy?
He had I don't know if you remember a show called Laugh-In.
Yeah, of course I do.
Back in the 60s.
I'm older than you think, Ken.
And I can't. I'm drawing a blank on
Rowan and Martin were the 2 leaders.
Rowan and Martin was the show, and one of the producers of Laugh-In was a pal of Nixon's, and he was really great at writing jokes, and so we'd reach out to him to do jokes for like the Gridiron Dinner and White House Correspondents' Dinner.
No kidding.
And Bill Sapphire was pretty good at quips, and we had a couple of other guys.
Wait a minute.
Pretty good stuff.
Wait a minute, Ken. You just reminded me of something, and going back to watching TV with my parents way back in the day and watching Goldie Hawn and all those guys on Laugh-In. President Nixon, I remember popping out of one of the boxes that they had on that Laugh-In show and saying, "Sock it to me, baby," right?
Yeah, it says, "Sock it to me." It says, "Sock it to me?"
Sock it to me?
Because of this buddy of his, and I wish I could recall his name, but anyway, this buddy of his who helped write some of his jokes talked him into being on the show. So it was totally unlike anybody ever saw Dick Nixon ever do.
Absolutely. We just thought it was funny, sort of off the wall for someone like Nixon, because he was always seen as such a serious guy, but it was hilarious when he sort of
humanized him, huh?
It really did, yeah. And believe me, he needed a little bit of that humanization. I understand that from the very beginning, the media was just horrible to him. And I got to say, they are to a lot of the conservatives. They don't like the conservative side of politics. But, you got a guy like Nixon who basically opened up relations with China, stopped the Vietnam War, did all these really great things, but the media was just after him from the very beginning. Was that something that you guys always had to contend with? That, and the way I mean it is, did you play to the media and try to appease them, or did you say, the hell with the media, our purpose is to give the speech to the people?
Well, I would say we did both. My first job in the Nixon White House was with Herb Klein. Herb Klein was a former editor with the San Diego Tribune, and Herb was director of communications, and I was on the communications staff. And so there was efforts made to reach out to the media, and when I say the media, it wasn't just the normal Washington Post, New York Times, and television networks. It was media across the country, because we felt that there was more than just the East Coast establishment media.
Right.
So there was efforts to reach out and communicate, but we also knew that you had to go over their heads and get to the people. And you have to remember, back in the 60s and early 70s, there was no cable. There was no cable news. There was no social media, and you had to deal with basically the three television networks and the major newspapers.
Right.
And that was it, and the wire services. So we had limited access, and if we couldn't get our stories told there, we had to go over their heads, and sometimes that was done by some very tough speeches.
Yeah, and when you think about it, at the time, there was no other alternatives like social media where you could get your word out. Literally, the president's speech was the only way to get to the people, and you had these three major networks that were going to spin it in a more liberal fashion, and basically, it was the president himself that had to support his ideals and try to communicate to the people directly.
Right. Yeah, and he did that periodically, especially when he had to create support for the Vietnam War, when there were demonstrations taking place all over the country, and that was the only means of way he had to create national support to keep that going, so he could also have the strength to negotiate very major decisions, like he negotiated two major arms limitation talks with the Soviet Union,
right,
and an anti-ballistic missile treaty with the Soviet Union. And at the same time, he was secretly in the process of trying to open up relationships with China. So to do that, he had to be able to show strength at home. If he showed weakness at home, he couldn't do any of that.
Right. And he succeeded in all those, too.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, of course, and we can't go without talking about it, he's going to be remembered most for Watergate and his resignation speech. When you found out that there was talks of this wrongdoing by Nixon and his possibly resigning, couple questions. Did it come as a shock to you? Were you part of the speech writing team that drafted the resignation speech? And was there a resistance on part of Nixon or the staff that was around him that says, no, we don't want you to resign. We think we could get through this?
Well, obviously, I was not senior enough to be involved in the resignation speech. I think Ray Price helped him work on that, but that was mostly President Nixon's job to write that. I was part of a team of attorneys and staff members who worked on helping stave off the Watergate attacks and resignation in the last year of his presidency. Right. And I must say I was one of those who resisted his resignation, and one of the last few people on his team who pleaded with him not to resign and to stick it out. And that's as you may or may not know, I'm in the midst of writing a memoir, and one of the chapters in my book that will be coming out sometime next year is about the final days of the presidency and our efforts to my efforts to help him maintain his presidency and prevent him from resigning.
One of the issues that I know it's going to be sort of difficult for you to talk about. I know you're writing your memoirs, but looking back on it, is there sort of an anger or resentment towards his actions and the resignation, etc., because it basically wiped out all the good things that you guys had worked on, all the speeches that were made, because now people are mainly going to remember him for the Watergate events and his resignation?
Well, time has changed a lot of that, Mark. So I think we've all made efforts to try to have history remember things like I don't know how. If you have any sons or some of your listeners have adult age boys, Nixon was the president who ended the draft. So if you have a 18-year-old son or young daughter now, they're not. They have to register for the draft, but they're not. They won't be drafted. We now have an all-volunteer army because of Richard Nixon.
Right, and so it's more of it's more that you have not a resentment or anything like that. It's more even important for you to tell the correct story and to correct the record as far as that's concerned.
Right. Yeah. So for those who are concerned about the environment, for example, he formed the Environmental Protection Agency. He started the war on cancer, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He desegregated the schools in the South when they were still segregated. So there were that plus all the agreements he did with the Soviets. He had extraordinary advancements to advance the Native Americans. We had a whole team of staff members there, and we had a national health insurance program that we tried to get through Congress that they stopped.
Yeah, he did.
Listen, a lot of things that we tried to achieve that haven't been publicized.
I've always said he was one of the greatest presidents. I was at his inauguration. I probably saw you there back in 1973. So it was a cold winter day in Washington. We're going to be right back with Ken Khachigian, speechwriter for Nixon and Reagan, right after this. This is the Marc Kapetan Show on KMJ. It's News Talk 580 1059 KMJ. Welcome back to the Marc Kapetan Show. Folks, we're going to get right back into it with Ken Khachigian, the speechwriter for Nixon and for Reagan. But real quick again, folks, if you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, friends, I want you to do yourselves a favor. Folks, I want you to do us a favor. Everybody could use a little bit more business, especially in these times of ever-increasing inflation. It's been nuts out there. So do us a favor at the Kapetan Brothers. We could always use a little bit of extra business, and we've been friends now on air for about 2-3 years. Send a case our way. If you know a friend, or if you've been in an auto accident or a truck accident or a motorcycle accident, send a case our way. We would love to have the extra business. We'll do a great job for you or your friends. If you've been arrested or cited for a criminal offense, call us 559-498-8000. Kapetan Brothers, we are the Valley's law firm. We're back on with Ken Khachigian, who is the speechwriter for Nixon and for Reagan and for Dan Quayle. Ken, one last question regarding Nixon, and then we're going to talk about your life. And next week, folks, we're going to have Ken on for one more segment or one more show talking all about Reagan. So I want you to stay tuned for that. Ken, who wrote the line? And you said that Nixon wrote most of his resignation speech. Who wrote the line, "I'm not a quitter"? Do you know if that came from him himself?
Well, I wrote a speech when he went down to, I think it was down to Alabama. And I don't know if he used the remarks I had prepared for him, but that was one of the few chances I had to prepare some remarks for him, and whether or not he chose to pick it up from a draft that I did or not.
So in your draft, you had this line, "I'm not a quitter," basically.
The way we prepared remarks for him is we didn't prepare speeches; we prepared suggested remarks. And so in one of the paragraphs that I prepared, I did prepare a line that said, in effect, something to the effect that Americans aren't quitter and I'm not a quitter, something like that. Oh,
interesting. Yeah. Neat. Oh, wow. It went down in history. Ken, listen, I mean, I'm assuming your family emigrated from Armenia way back in the day?
Well, my dad, my mom's family came over from Turkey in the late 19th century and then early 20th century. So they fortunately escaped the genocide. And so my mom was actually born in Fresno and went to Clovis High School. And dad was born in Turkey in a small village and was a genocide survivor. He lost his mother, my grandmother, and my uncle and my aunt. My grandfather on my father's side had come over earlier and was in Visalia, waiting to bring them over when they got caught up in the genocide. Fortunately, my dad survived, but he was for 5.5 years was in the Middle East before my grandfather could bring him over in 1920 when he got to Visalia. And so, but my mom was born here and, like I say, went to Clovis High School.
Did you guys have the typical thing, like my grandparents came from Greece around the same time, and I don't know where this fervor or love that we had for America, American might, American power, American, ingenuity, et cetera, but it definitely was partly, or maybe primarily, from my grandfather coming over as a young immigrant and having nothing in his pockets, and through hard work making it.
Well, there's no question of that. My mother's dad, poor guy, lost a couple of farms in the Depression, and they lived a very meager existence there. And I know they're one of the first places they lost, I think, was on Fresno and Gettysburg. I wish we had that today.
Yeah, right.
And my dad came over and started out with 20 acres and built it up to 60 acres. And of course, my three brothers and I, we lived a life as farmhands. We knew nothing else other than growing up, and we had to have a life of ingenuity and had to show the ability to get up early in the morning and weekends and working hard. And so,
and in that, I was about to say, and in that sense, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but in that sense, your politics and your lifestyle and your beliefs on how to be successful in America aligned with Reagan and Nixon, that it was all personal responsibility, that you had to do the work yourself.
There's no question. Absolutely. And I mean, nothing was given to us. That's for right. Sure. It was, I can tell you that.
And in that sense, did your politics aligning, do you think that a person has to have that same mindset to be able to write these speeches for these presidents?
Well, it's the main thing is to get a good education, Mark. And that's one thing my mom pounded into us growing up. And then the public, we enjoyed I thought a pretty good public school system
right
back in the day, and we had to study hard, and took the school bus in, and I went to a little elementary school, Viva Blunter in Visalia, and then went to the Visadero Junior High and Mount Whitney High School, and you studied hard. We didn't have computers and all the fancy stuff you had today, and you did everything by reading books in the library. And
And then you made it to the top of your career. You were a presidential speechwriter. Listen, I'm going to cut you off here. So we'll be back next week with Ken Khachigian, who was the speechwriter for President Nixon and for President Reagan. Ken, thanks. We'll see you next week, right?
Right.
All right, pal. Next week, Ken Khachigian on the Marc Kapetan Show. This is KMJ.